Imagine a dynasty where old Puritan bloodline meets Gilded Age ambition, a family that didn't just shape America's elite but helped draw its borders, fund its wars, and even sculpt its culture. The Whitneys weren't just rich, they were royalty in everything but name. From William Collins Whitney, the cunning lawyer who transformed streetcars into a $700 million empire, to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who carved her legacy into the walls of the American art world, their name became shorthand for power, privilege, and patronage. But behind the elegant facades and museum wings lies a darker, more elusive truth, one buried beneath layers of political favors, monopolistic deals, and whispered scandals, ties to the opium trade, covert family rifts, and a legacy of influence so deep it rivals even the Rockefellers and the Delanos. This isn't just a family tree, it's a labyrinth of secrets. Welcome to the hidden history of the Whitney family, where wealth wasn't inherited, it was weaponized. From new money to old money before Silicon Valley minted overnight billionaires and Wall Street carved kings out of hedge fund cowboys. There were the Whitneys, an American dynasty built not on spectacle, but on precision. They weren't plastered on tabloids like the Rockefellers or making reckless headlines like the Vanderbilts. The Whitneys moved differently. They didn't need noise. Their power ran through boardrooms, cultural institutions, and art museums, quiet, calculated, and generational. And what makes them even more fascinating? Most people walk right past their legacy without even knowing it. A Whitney-funded museum here, a foundation there, a racehorse named after a family member. They've become part of the American landscape, woven so seamlessly into its fabric that their presence is felt more than seen. But to understand how they got there, you have to go back, way back. It starts in the raw, chaotic momentum of Gilded Age New York, a city exploding with ambition, filth, and the relentless noise of steel crashing against steel. It's the late 1800s, and American industry is on fire. Fortunes are being made overnight in oil-steel railroads. Amid that frenzy, one man is quietly engineering his rise, William Collins Whitney. Born in 1841 in Conway, Massachusetts, William didn't arrive with wealth. But what he had was almost more dangerous: a sharp legal mind and a family name that dated back to the Puritans, descendants of John Whitney, who stepped off the boat in Watertown in 1635. William wasn't loud, he was strategic. After graduating from Yale and Harvard Law School, he entered New York's political scene like a tactician entering a chessboard. He aligned himself with the most powerful men of his time, bankers, senators, businessmen, and quickly became a trusted legal and political figure. When President Grover Cleveland took office in 1885, William was tapped as Secretary of the Navy. But this wasn't just about reorganizing warships. This was about access. During his time in office, William oversaw the modernization of the U.S. Navy, from wooden ships to steel. And guess what? He also had stakes in companies that stood to profit from those exact contracts. It's a blueprint that would later define the military-industrial complex, long before anyone put that label on it. And while there's no hard evidence of corruption, the overlap between public office and private interest raised eyebrows. It wouldn't be the last time. After stepping down from the cabinet, William zeroed in on what would become the crown jewel of his fortune, New York City's streetcar system. At the time, the city's public transit was a mess, disjointed, underfunded, and controlled by a maze of competing companies. William saw opportunity. He orchestrated a brilliant, ruthless consolidation, buying out rivals, merging firms, and creating what essentially became a transit monopoly. Imagine today if one person owned Uber, the subway system, and every bus line in a major city. That's the kind of control he wielded. By the end of the 1890s, William's wealth had ballooned to an estimated $23 million, equivalent to more than $700 million today. But unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't blow it on gilded ceilings and diamond-studded carriages. He invested strategically. He bought into the Metropolitan Steamship Company, which dominated the Boston-New York corridor, a crucial artery for East Coast commerce. Then came the mines, investments in the frigid but rich territories of Canada's Hudson Bay, tapping into iron ore and copper veins that would keep the Whitney coffers full for decades. But here's the thing about old money. It's not just made, it's curated. In Gilded Age America, cash could open doors, but bloodlines kept you inside the room. So William married up, way up. His wife, Edith Randolph, came from one of Virginia's oldest and most aristocratic families, descendants of Thomas Jefferson and part of the Southern planter elite. It wasn't just a love match, it was a strategic alliance. Their union cemented the Whitneys as not just rich, but respectable. Their children were born into a kind of dual nobility, Yankee industriousness on one side, Southern heritage on the other. But the real turning point for the Whitney legacy came through their daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gertrude was a force of nature. On paper, she had it all. She was a Vanderbilt on her mother's side, Whitney on her father's, and married to Harry Payne Whitney, whose family had Standard Oil in its veins. But Gertrude didn't coast. She broke rules. She sculpted. She painted. She traveled alone in Europe when that was still taboo for upper-class women. And in 1930, she founded the Whitney Museum of American Art. Now, at the time, that was a radical move. Major institutions like the Met were obsessed with old masters and European imports. American artists, they were often dismissed as provincial, second-rate. Gertrude said, "Not on my watch." She used her own fortune, over $100 million in today's money, to buy, collect, and promote American art. Her personal collection included early works by Edward Hopper, Thomas Hart Benton, and Georgia O'Keeffe. She gave them a home. She gave American art a voice. She gave it legitimacy. Meanwhile, her husband Harry was taking the Whitney brand into sports. A Yale graduate, a polo champion, and a horse racing mogul, Harry founded the Green Tree Stable. Under his leadership, the Whitneys became dominant in American horse racing. At the Saratoga racecourse, their horses were legendary. They didn't just attend the races, they owned them. Their son, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, nicknamed CV, took it all to the next level. Imagine someone who straddled Wall Street, Hollywood, aviation, mining, and philanthropy with ease. That was CV, educated at Yale. He was charming, media savvy, and shrewd. He co-financed Gone with the Wind, one of the highest grossing films of all time, and helped develop Technicolor, which changed cinema forever. That's right, the vibrant reds and deep greens that defined Hollywood's golden age. You partly have a Whitney to thank for that. But CV wasn't just about movies. He had stakes in mining companies across North America. He helped establish Pan American Airways, one of the first commercial airlines to truly globalize air travel. He kept the family's legacy alive through the Whitney Foundation, art patronage, and generous support for museums and universities. At the height of his power, C.V. Whitney's portfolio touched more industries than the Morgans or DuPonts without ever drawing the same level of public scrutiny. Why? Because the Whitneys knew how to keep quiet. That was their strength. They didn't need to be the loudest family in the room. They just needed to own the room. And then there were politics. Whitney's tenure as Secretary of the Navy blurred the lines between government service and personal enrichment. His proximity to defense contracts, his lobbying for steel shipbuilders, and his partnerships with connected financiers all paint a familiar picture. One we've seen play out in countless scandals since. Think Teapot Dome decades before it happened. Inside the family, not everything was stable either. As the decades rolled on and new generations took over, the once tightly controlled Whitney empire began to splinter. Greentree, the sprawling 400-acre estate in Manhasset, became a source of contention. Some heirs wanted to preserve it as a family sanctuary. Others wanted to sell. Legal battles over trusts, art collections, and estate maintenance dragged on. In some cases, priceless paintings vanished in inheritance fights. Family relationships frayed. Some heirs distanced themselves, others clung to legacy as if it were oxygen. Yet the core remained. Because the Whitneys had done what so many dynasties failed to do, they planned carefully, meticulously. Their wealth wasn't a pile of cash waiting to be squandered. It was held in trusts, managed by professionals, diversified across industries and continents. While the Vanderbilts lost their fortune, at one point not a single heir could afford to maintain the family mansions. The Whitneys evolved. They didn't bet everything on railroads or steel. They spread it out. They played the long game. Today, the Whitney Museum stands in Manhattan's chic meatpacking district, housed in a sleek, modern space designed by Renzo Piano. It's a temple to American creativity and a living monument to Gertrude's vision. Meanwhile, Greentree lives on too. It's no longer a private playground. It's the site of the Greentree Foundation, hosting peace negotiations, global policy conferences, and diplomatic retreats. William Whitney's opium trade connections. In the 1880s, New York City stood as a beacon of progress and prosperity, its skyline punctuated by the glow of gas lamps and the ceaseless churn of industry. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along cobblestone streets, their wheels grinding against the stone as plumes of smoke rose from countless chimneys, cloaking the city in a perpetual haze. This was the Gilded Age, a time of dazzling wealth and innovation, but also of stark inequality and hidden corruption. Beneath the glittering facade of high society and industrial triumph, darker currents flowed, driven by ambition and secrecy. At the heart of this era stood William Collins Whitney, a man whose polished demeanor and strategic brilliance made him one of the most influential figures in America. Known to history as a reformer, a Secretary of the Navy, and the architect of New York's streetcar system, Whitney's legacy is one of achievement. Yet, a closer examination reveals a more complex story, one that questions how a modestly successful lawyer ascended to extraordinary wealth in just a few years. Such a meteoric rise rarely comes without compromise, and the shadows cast by Whitney's success point to a troubling possibility. His involvement in the opium trade, a lucrative but morally fraught enterprise that defined the 19th century. Central to Whitney's empire was the Metropolitan Steamship Company, a venture that, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. Its fleet of vessels transported goods between Boston and New York, with occasional routes extending to distant ports such as San Francisco and New Orleans. These were no ordinary ships, however, sleek, powerful, and built for speed. They were engineering marvels capable of outpacing competitors and evading scrutiny. While the company's manifest listed conventional cargo, iron, lumber, and textiles, a growing body of evidence suggests these ships carried a far more profitable commodity, opium. The opium trade in the 19th century was not the illicit underworld of modern imagination. It was a corporate, institutionalized industry woven into the fabric of global commerce. Laudanum, a potent mixture of opium and alcohol, was a staple in pharmacies, prescribed for ailments ranging from insomnia to indigestion. Opium-based pills were marketed as remedies for adults and even infants, their dangers masked by widespread acceptance. Behind this veneer of respectability, vast fortunes were amassed, often at the expense of human suffering. To understand Whitney's potential role in this trade, one must first examine Russell and Company, the American titan of the Chinese opium market. Founded in 1818, Russell and Company dealt in silk, tea, and porcelain, but its true wealth stemmed from opium. In partnership with British firms like Jardine Matheson, the company shipped thousands of chests of opium into Chinese ports, fueling an addiction crisis that destabilized the Qing dynasty and sparked international conflict. By the 1880s, as diplomatic pressures mounted and scrutiny intensified, Russell and Company sought discreet partners to maintain its operations. William Whitney, with his sophisticated fleet and insider connections, emerged as a likely ally. The Metropolitan Steamship Company's ships were ideally suited for such a partnership. Their size accommodated bulk freight, their speed minimized the risk of inspections, and their operations were discreet enough to avoid international attention. Surviving records from the period, however, raise red flags. Shipping logs are incomplete, with entire months unaccounted for. Voyages that should have taken days stretched into weeks without explanation. In some instances, port authorities recorded ships docking with no evidence of cargo being loaded or unloaded. Such discrepancies suggest the transport of goods that left no paper trail, a hallmark of the opium trade. The evidence, connecting the dots. Historians and financial investigators have uncovered compelling, if circumstantial, evidence linking Whitney to Russell and Company's operations. Customs ledgers, preserved in the National Archives and digitized by maritime research initiatives, reveal overlapping shipping agents. One name stands out: H.B. Coolidge, a freight broker for Whitney's company, who previously served as a clerk in Russell & Co.'s opium fleet in Canton. This connection, while not definitive, is significant. Additional records show shared logistics networks, with Whitney's ships operating on routes that mirrored those used by Russell & Co.'s opium transports. The financial incentives for such a venture were staggering. At its peak, a single pound of raw opium could yield profits of up to 1,600% when processed into laudanum or morphine for Western markets. A few covert shipments could transform a steamship line's valuation, and a man with Whitney's resources, capital, connections, and naval expertise stood to gain immensely. Notably, Whitney's wealth surged dramatically between 1882 and 1889, coinciding with the expansion of his shipping empire and Russell & Co.'s efforts to navigate diplomatic crackdowns in China. The dissolution of Russell & Company in 1891, just as Whitney exited the shipping industry and pivoted to New York real estate and political ventures, adds further weight to the timeline. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in what is missing. Unlike his contemporaries, Whitney left behind scant financial documentation from this period. The Metropolitan Steamship Company's archives, reviewed by biographers in the mid-20th century, were curiously sparse. Requests for manifests from the New York Port Authority for Whitney's ships in the 1880s yielded little. Many logs were either lost or never filed. Entire vessels vanished from registry records without explanation, a rarity in an era known for meticulous bookkeeping. Whitney's position as Secretary of the Navy afforded him unique advantages. As a cabinet member, he wielded influence over maritime regulations and access to sensitive information about shipping routes. This authority, combined with his social and political connections, enabled him to operate with minimal scrutiny. Rumors, if they surfaced, could be quashed before reaching the press. The absence of contemporary criticism or investigation into Whitney's activities may be the most telling sign of his ability to control the narrative. Whitney's story is not unique. It mirrors the trajectories of other Gilded Age magnates whose fortunes were tied to the opium trade. Leland Stanford, the railroad baron, faced allegations that his shipping lines trafficked Chinese opium into California in the 1870s. The Delano family, ancestors of Franklin D. Roosevelt, built their wealth smuggling opium into China through their own fleet. The playbook was consistent: accumulate wealth through questionable means, deflect scrutiny, and cement a legacy through philanthropy and public service. Whitney's later investments in New York's infrastructure and his prominent role in Democratic politics align with this pattern, casting his earlier ventures in a new light. William Whitney's political corruption scandal. By the time William Collins Whitney was handed the keys to the U.S. Navy in 1885, his name already carried weight in the highest circles of politics and business. He was sharp, strategic, and, as history would later reveal, not afraid to bend rules when power and profit were within reach. While he'd already made a fortune through streetcar monopolies and discreet shipping operations, some allegedly tied to the opium trade, his tenure as Secretary of the Navy marked a turning point in how far he was willing to go. It wasn't just about public service. It was about carving out influence at the very core of the American government and turning the defense budget into a personal ATM. Officially, his appointment under President Grover Cleveland looked like a win for reform. The Navy at the time was a floating museum: outdated wooden ships, dwindling manpower, and declining morale. Whitney stepped in with grand ambition. He pushed for modernization, championing a fleet of steel-hulled vessels and bringing in new contracts to revitalize shipbuilding across the country. His vision was hailed in the press as forward-thinking and bold. Congress approved his initiatives. Editorials called him a hero. But while the country praised his naval renaissance, very few knew what was happening behind closed doors and buried deep in budget lines. According to reports published by the New York Times and corroborated by multiple political historians, Whitney wasn't just overseeing Navy contracts. He was profiting from them. During his 4-year term, he quietly accepted more than $500,000 in kickbacks from favored shipbuilders. That figure might seem modest by today's standards, but adjusted for inflation, it equates to nearly $17 million. And this wasn't a one-off scandal. It was a structured, repeated practice, built on backdoor deals, dummy corporations, and careful legal camouflage. The kind of corruption so intricately woven into the system, it looked like standard procedure. The scheme operated with a simplicity that was almost elegant. Contractors, many of whom had long-standing ties to Whitney through his business and legal circles, would submit inflated bids for naval construction projects. Once the contracts were awarded, a portion of those inflated profits would find their way back to Whitney through shell companies listed under third-party names, often filed in states with loose corporate transparency laws. Payments were disguised as consulting fees, logistics planning, or miscellaneous reimbursements buried in bureaucratic language. These line items were never questioned. After all, who would suspect the reformist Secretary of the Navy of orchestrating a con? But even more revealing than how the scheme worked was how it was protected. When early rumors started swirling, when auditors noticed missing ledgers or unusual payment patterns, nothing came of it. That's because Whitney wasn't just operating solo. He had cover from the very top. His relationship with Grover Cleveland wasn't professional. It was personal and political. Whitney had been one of Cleveland's key backers during his rise to power, a financial ally who had used his fortune and influence to position Cleveland as a clean alternative to machine politics. In return, The president ensured that any heat on Whitney disappeared before it even reached the public. When internal Navy investigators began quietly poking into inconsistencies in the contracting process, they were promptly reassigned or their departments restructured. Memos that raised concerns were never followed up. Reports vanished, sometimes entirely. Whistleblowers were quietly offered promotions or silenced through what one historian described as strategic exile. The deeper the questions went, the more locked doors they encountered. And with Cleveland's office labeling it all as routine oversight, the press had no reason to dig further. What's striking is how closely this entire scandal mirrors other high-level cases of Gilded Age corruption. Just a few years earlier, Interior Secretary Columbus Delano, incidentally Franklin Roosevelt's great-uncle, was exposed for accepting bribes in exchange for land grants and mining rights. That scandal, while shocking, was quickly buried with minimal damage to the broader administration. In Whitney's case, however, the protection ran deeper and the silence more total. Delano was expendable. Whitney was indispensable, at least to Cleveland's inner circle and the broader elite benefiting from his deals. In hindsight, political scholars now view Whitney's operation as one of the most efficient systems of institutional graft in American naval history. It didn't require brashness like the Tweed Ring. It didn't involve suitcases of cash like Teapot Dome. It was cleaner, smarter, safer, and most importantly, it worked. Shipyards associated with Whitney's personal investment network secured nearly 3 times more contracts than their competitors during his term. Naval supply companies connected to his law firm were funneled business without competitive bidding. Even fuel procurement routes were steered toward shipping lines operated by old friends or firms tied to the Metropolitan Steamship Company, which Whitney still had a hand in long after his official departure from the industry. By the time he resigned from his post in 1889, William Whitney wasn't just respected. He was untouchable. The press still described him in glowing terms. Political insiders still toasted him at dinner parties. There were no investigations, no headlines, no public hearings. And that's perhaps the most chilling element of it all. A scandal of that size, that depth, that level of national implication was effectively erased in real time. It would take decades for the full scale of the corruption to come into focus. Only when historians began analyzing long-forgotten correspondence, private letters between Whitney and Cleveland now housed in the Library of Congress, did the outlines become clearer. In these letters, there are subtle but telling phrases, references to timely arrangements, cooperative contractors, and necessary discretion. One note even alludes to an understanding about naval appropriations that should not be politicized. It doesn't scream guilt, but it doesn't sound innocent either. And when cross-referenced with naval budget gaps and award patterns, the implications become hard to ignore. Yet despite all of this, Whitney's name was never dragged through the mud. He remained a fixture of high society, still gave speeches, still sat on museum boards, still donated to Harvard. When people spoke of him, they spoke of vision and patriotism, not bribes and betrayal. That's how effective the cover-up was. It didn't just protect him from consequence. It protected his legacy. Gertrude Whitney's secret affair with Juliana Force. For a family that built its empire on strategy, silence, and perfectly curated power, there was always one story they could never quite erase, one too fragile to name, too personal to frame in a headline. It had nothing to do with Navy contracts, opium ships, or rigged streetcar monopolies. No bribery, no corruption, no legal loophole could explain it. This secret wasn't financial, it was human. And for the Whitney family, a dynasty obsessed with image, control, and permanence that made it the most dangerous secret of all. At the center of this long hidden chapter is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the woman who defied her name. She wasn't just born into American royalty, the Vanderbilts. She also married into the equally powerful Whitneys. Yet rather than playing the expected role of a silent socialite, Gertrude carved a path that made her a legend in her own right. She was a sculptor, a patron, and a cultural visionary who laid the foundation for one of America's most enduring artistic institutions, the Whitney Museum of American Art. Her mission was radical for its time. She championed American artists when European art still dominated. She gave platform to names like Hopper, Bellows, and O'Keeffe. She did it with taste, with money, and with astonishing resolve. But if you look closely at that legacy just beneath the polished museum floors and bronze commemorative plaques, you begin to see another story emerge, one far more intimate, carefully edited out of official biographies and press releases. This one centers not around wealth or politics, but around another woman, Juliana Force. Juliana didn't come from money. She wasn't a Vanderbilt, wasn't a Whitney, and yet in many ways she held the key to both. She met Gertrude in the 1920s, during the earliest days of Gertrude's crusade to give American modernism a home. When the Whitney Museum opened its doors in 1931, Gertrude chose Juliana as its first director, a move that, at the time, was almost unthinkable. Women didn't run museums in that era. They certainly didn't do so with the power and autonomy Juliana held. Their partnership was the heart of the museum's success. Gertrude provided the vision and the capital. Juliana built the institution from the ground up, curating exhibitions, defending controversial artists, navigating the politics of boardrooms filled with skeptical men. But as the museum rose, so did questions. The two women were inseparable in public and in private. Their letters, which surfaced decades later in fragments tucked inside family collections and private archive boxes, tell a story most were never supposed to hear. They spoke in layered language, coded warmth, and emotional shorthand that hinted at something deeper than friendship. Juliana, in her diary, once wrote about an evening with G, noting that the silence between us said more than any words ever could. Another entry from a 1937 train ride reads, "I missed her hand beside mine, the weight of it, the familiarity." These were not workplace notes. They were echoes of longing, subtle, buried in prose, but unmistakably personal. Historians have long debated the nature of their bond. Was it romantic? Was it physical? Was it just the kind of deep companionship between women that Victorian society didn't have language for? The truth, of course, is complicated. But what's not complicated is this. The Whitney family worked hard to keep the story quiet. As they had done with other shadows on their spotless legacy, they acted quickly. Letters disappeared. Staff members who worked during the museum's founding years were discouraged from giving interviews. Archive folders were mislabeled or accidentally misplaced. The reasons for the silence were painfully clear. Gertrude's social standing wasn't just personal status, it was capital. She was the face of the Whitney Museum, its benefactor and matriarch. Her respectability kept money flowing, doors opening, and critics at bay. A public revelation about her relationship with another woman, especially one employed by her museum, wouldn't just threaten her image. It could destabilize the entire institution, but it never disappeared. Independent scholars, feminist historians, and LGBTQ+ researchers have spent years pulling back the layers, connecting dots between correspondence, travelogues, and museum calendars. They found Juliana at Gertrude's side at nearly every key moment in the museum's history. They found shared hotel stays, coded language, and overlapping schedules that suggest a relationship far more intimate than any board minutes or newspaper clippings ever recorded. And they found, most of all, a pattern of erasure. Juliana Force never married. She rarely spoke publicly about her private life. But in every professional move she made, every risky exhibition she defended, every young artist she championed, there was the quiet presence of someone who knew she wasn't just protecting a museum. She was protecting a woman she loved. And Gertrude, she too never remarried after her husband's death. Her later years were spent immersed in art, surrounded by works that spoke of conflict, loneliness, and yearning. Some say her sculptures began to shift in tone, less grand, more introspective. She gave interviews, of course. She smiled for portraits. But the woman behind the marble and the metal was perhaps still holding on to a story that could never be safely told. Today, the Whitney Museum continues to evolve. Under new leadership, its curators and directors have begun acknowledging the fuller picture, the untold narratives not just of the artists on its walls, but of the people who built the walls themselves. Recent retrospectives have examined Gertrude and Juliana as partners, in power, in vision, and perhaps in love. Panels and exhibitions have opened space for the possibility that America's most progressive art institution was, in part, shaped by a relationship that dared not speak its name. Harry Payne Whitney's gambling addiction. Harry Payne Whitney, the heir, the sportsman, the husband of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and the dangerous secret that nearly unraveled it all, a devastating addiction to gambling that cost him millions, risked the family legacy, and remained buried under a carefully constructed wall of silence. Born in 1872 into a world where wealth was inherited, not earned, Harry Payne Whitney had every advantage a man could imagine. His father, William C. Whitney, had been Secretary of the Navy and one of the most powerful men in New York finance and politics. His mother, Flora Payne Whitney, came from the immensely wealthy Standard Oil-connected Payne family. Harry's path was paved with privilege and expectations. He was sent to Yale, graduated from Columbia Law School, and instead of practicing law, dove headfirst into the two things he loved most: breeding horses and winning at the track. To the outside world, Harry was the embodiment of refined masculinity. He was tall, athletic, famously good-looking, and an exceptional sportsman. He was a champion polo player, a respected horse breeder, and a familiar face in elite social circles from New York to Newport. When he married Gertrude Vanderbilt, the strong-willed heiress of the powerful Vanderbilt Empire, in 1896, it was more than a union of two people. It was the merger of two dynasties. Their combined wealth and social capital made them American royalty. Together they raised 3 children and built lives, framed by art, politics, and philanthropy. But beneath the polished exterior, Harry was nursing a dangerous compulsion. He didn't just enjoy betting on horses, he needed it. According to speculation from sources like American Heritage, Harry had a deeply entrenched gambling addiction that wasn't limited to the racetracks of Saratoga. He reportedly lost staggering sums of money at European casinos, Monte Carlo, Biarritz, and Deauville, places where high society played hard, and consequences were left at the door. In an era where discretion was paramount and scandal could destroy reputations, these losses had to be handled quietly, and they were. The Whitney family, ever vigilant in protecting their name, is believed to have intervened behind the scenes. According to historians, they paid off Harry's creditors in hushed transactions, quietly cleaning up after him, just as other powerful families did during the Gilded Age. Think of Georgiana Cavendish, the Duchess of Devonshire, who lost fortunes gambling on cards, or Helen Gould, whose alleged breakdown was shielded by layers of public spin and private payoffs. This was standard practice among elites. Scandal was never denied, only hidden. And Harry's gambling wasn't just a bad habit. It had a cascading effect. Imagine trying to maintain the illusion of control while hemorrhaging money in back rooms and salons. The sums involved were not small. Estimates suggest he may have lost millions, an enormous amount in early 20th century dollars. Adjusted for inflation, these losses would be worth well over $100 million today. If true, these weren't casual losses from a few careless nights at the baccarat table. This was systemic, damaging, and relentless. The most infamous location tied to his gambling was Saratoga Springs, the crown jewel of New York's horse racing culture. Founded in the 19th century, Saratoga had become a playground for America's elite, where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Harry wasn't just a bettor. He was deeply embedded in the racing scene. He bred winners. He backed tracks. He was a giant in the industry. And yet, the same sport that built his public image may have quietly drained his bank account. Attempts to find direct betting records tied to Harry at Saratoga have proven elusive. That's not surprising. Bookmakers at the time didn't exactly keep transparent ledgers, and any debts he owed were likely handled off the books or buried by legal teams working to preserve the Whitney name. What is clear is that when Harry died in 1930, the full extent of his financial situation was never publicly disclosed. The family took over his affairs seamlessly, and Gertrude, fiercely independent and already building her own artistic legacy, moved forward without public mention of financial strain. And this secrecy wasn't unique to the Whitneys. Throughout the American aristocracy, stories like these played out in drawing rooms and private clubs across the East Coast. Take Ida Alice Flagler, for instance. The wife of oil magnate Henry Flagler, she was quietly institutionalized when her mental health unraveled, with the family working tirelessly to ensure her name was kept out of the press. Or Paul Mellon, another Gilded Age heir, whose own mental health challenges and erratic behavior were carefully curated behind a wall of family lawyers, PR experts, and medical gatekeepers. For these families, reputation was everything. Anything that threatened the image had to be erased or paid off. So why does Harry Payne Whitney's story matter today? Because it reveals something crucial about the American elite, not just the opulence or the power, but the fragility that lies just beneath the surface. For all the grandeur and self-assurance, the old money families were often dancing on a knife's edge, relying on silence, secrecy, and wealth to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. Harry was one of them, a brilliant horseman, a patron of the arts, a loving husband, and a man at war with himself. The addiction didn't define him entirely, but it cast a long shadow over the legacy he tried so hard to build. Interestingly, even as Harry battled his demons, he continued to achieve remarkable public successes. He founded one of the most powerful racing stables in the United States and bred Regret, the first filly to win the Kentucky Derby in 1915. His name remains etched into the fabric of American horse racing history. But behind every trophy, there may have been a debt note. Behind every win, the sting of a greater loss. Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney's Hollywood blackmail. What happens when old money walks into the dream factory of Hollywood? You'd think the studios would be calling the shots. You'd think the men behind the cameras had the power. But in the 1930s, Los Angeles, behind the scenes of one of the most iconic films in American history, a different kind of mogul may have been pulling strings, using quiet threats, power plays, and the sheer weight of a family name that made even the titans of Hollywood pause. This is the chillingly plausible yet carefully silent story of Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney and the whispered blackmail that allegedly pushed Gone with the Wind across the finish line. Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney wasn't your average film producer. He didn't climb the ladder. He didn't hustle his way up from screenwriting or camera work. He arrived in Hollywood already draped in American royalty. As the great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon who built an empire, and the son of financier and horse breeder Harry Payne Whitney and artist philanthropist Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Cornelius came with a last name that could open any door and shut any mouth. But despite the privilege, Cornelius had ambition, real ambition. He wasn't content with being a trust fund darling, dabbling in hobbies. He wanted his own legend. By the 1930s, he had dipped into aviation, backed technological ventures, and, most notably, set his sights on the motion picture business, which was in the midst of transitioning into sound and cementing its grip on American culture. Enter MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the studio known for its roaring lion, glittering stars, and ruthless executives. At the time, MGM was under the iron control of Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, who ran the studio like a fortress. Scripts were heavily censored, actors were tightly controlled, and no project got the green light without their approval. They were powerful, yes, but not untouchable. And if the rumors are true, Cornelius found a way to pierce their armor. The story that circulated among researchers, Hollywood historians, and speculative corners of outlets like Forbes is that Whitney, driven to bring Gone with the Wind to life, used his immense wealth and Vanderbilt influence to pressure MGM into coughing up the necessary support. The claim? That he allegedly blackmailed MGM executives, threatening to expose undisclosed deals or personal scandals if the studio didn't back the project or align with his vision. Now, let's be clear, there's no police report, no court case, no smoking gun letter labeled blackmail, but the speculation is persistent, and the context makes it more than just idle gossip. In the 1930s, MGM was already walking a tightrope with public morality, government scrutiny, and internal turmoil. A whisper in the wrong place could end careers. A headline could end a studio. So when someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney came knocking, with connections to Washington, Wall Street, and the wealth to buy entire media networks, studio heads had every reason to listen and cooperate. Consider this. Cornelius wasn't just rich. He had strategic power. His mother, Gertrude, was building the Whitney Museum of American Art. His father had dominated the horse racing world. The family had long tentacles in finance, politics, and culture, and Cornelius himself had close ties to powerful names in both government and journalism. In a time when the media could be weaponized with a phone call, and when sexual scandals or financial fraud could ruin lives overnight, it's entirely plausible that he used leverage that never had to be spelled out in writing. It's not unlike how Henry Cabot Lodge, another elite political figure of the era, allegedly used blackmail tactics to control political rivals, or how industrialist Henry Clay Frick orchestrated strategic land seizures behind closed doors. These weren't crimes carried out in back alleys. They were quiet games of chess played by men who understood that true power is about making someone say yes without ever having to say why. Whitney, unlike other producers, didn't need studio money to get a film started. What he needed was distribution muscle, prestige, and public legitimacy. Gone with the Wind, based on Margaret Mitchell's best-selling Civil War novel, was a volatile project. It was expensive, politically charged, logistically massive. Many in Hollywood balked at its scale and risk. But Cornelius believed in it, and according to several speculative accounts, he was willing to use every trick in the book to ensure it didn't fail. One of the most compelling pieces of circumstantial evidence is how quietly Cornelius's name vanished from the major production credits. He had early involvement in the project, possibly as a financier or intermediary, but was later minimized in the publicity. Why? Some suggest it was to maintain his image as a gentleman philanthropist, far from the sleazy Hollywood backlot drama. Others believe the studio agreed to sweep his involvement under the rug once his influence had served its purpose. And remember, Whitney's public persona was everything. He was a Navy pilot, a philanthropist, a sportsman. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. He moved through political and high society circles with ease. The last thing he, or the Vanderbilt name, could afford was a whisper of coercion or extortion. So if there was blackmail, it had to stay hidden. Paper trails destroyed, phone calls denied, NDAs before NDAs existed. In the broader scope of history, Gone with the Wind became the highest-grossing film of its time and won 10 Academy Awards. And while producer David O. Selznick gets the credit, the shadow of early influence remains unclear. Some believe Cornelius helped grease the wheels in ways that had nothing to do with screenplays or cameras, and everything to do with making powerful people sweat just enough to say yes. Adding another layer, let's not forget Cornelius's Hollywood career didn't stop with Gone with the Wind. He went on to finance several films, including The Searchers, 1956, starring John Wayne and directed by John Ford, widely regarded as one of the greatest westerns of all time. His name, while rarely front and center in Hollywood lore, was always there in the margins, whispered by insiders and referenced in confidential memos. Now, in trying to verify the blackmail claim, journalists and historians have combed through MGM production notes, personal letters, and internal studio correspondence from the 1930s. So far, no single document confirms the story. But this isn't surprising. If a man like Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney wanted a favor done quietly, he'd know exactly how to make it disappear just as quietly afterward. And for the Whitney family, reputation management was nothing new. This was the same family that allegedly covered up Harry Payne Whitney's gambling debts in Saratoga in Europe. The same clan that operated, like many American dynasties of the Gilded Age and beyond, using their fortune to protect their narrative at all costs. It's also worth comparing Cornelius's strategy to Mary Lily Keenan Flagler's situation decades earlier. After the suspicious death of her husband, Standard Oil co-founder Henry Flagler, Mary Lily reportedly lived under the influence of morphine dispensed and controlled by those around her. Her will became the subject of fierce legal battles, and much like the Whitney whispers, the real story may never be fully known, only suggested through patterns of behavior, power plays, and tightly managed legacies. Whitney family's streetcar monopoly abuses. In the twilight of the 19th century, New York City pulsed with a raw, untamed energy. The 1880s unfurled a tapestry of ambition and chaos, where the streets thrummed with the footsteps of immigrants pouring in from distant shores, their dreams mingling with the steam rising from manhole covers. Horse-drawn carriages clattered alongside peddlers' cries, and the skyline began its audacious climb, forged in brick and steel. This was the Gilded Age, a time when titans like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller reshaped the nation's bones with railroads, steel, and oil. Their names became synonymous with wealth and power, their empires etched into the American psyche. Yet, amid this cacophony of industrial conquest, one man worked in the shadows, weaving a subtler but no less formidable dominion. His name was William Collins Whitney, and his battlefield was not the sprawling railroads or oil fields, but the very arteries of the city itself, its streetcars. Whitney was no flamboyant showman like Jay Gould, nor did he carry the mythic aura of J.P. Morgan. His was a quieter ambition, a calculated precision that made him all the more dangerous. While the great barons hoarded resources, Whitney saw opportunity in something more elemental: movement. In a city swelling with humanity, where tenements brimmed and commerce roared, the ability to control how people moved was to hold the city's pulse. Streetcars, those clanging, horse-drawn, and later electrified lifelines, were not just a mode of transport. They were the veins through which New York's lifeblood flowed. Whitney understood this before anyone else. By monopolizing the tracks that crisscrossed Manhattan, he could own the city, not with fanfare, but with a grip so seamless it went unnoticed until it was unbreakable. His ascent was no accident. A lawyer by training, Whitney honed his instincts in the crucible of New York's political and financial elite. His tenure as Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland gave him a master's education in power, while his ties to Wall Street's most ruthless financiers armed him with the capital and cunning to execute his vision. Whitney didn't just build a streetcar company, he constructed an empire of control. His crown jewel, the Metropolitan Street Railway Company, became a juggernaut through a relentless campaign of mergers, acquisitions, and political maneuvering. By the early 1890s, Whitney had devoured his competitors, absorbing rival lines with the cold efficiency of a predator. Smaller companies vanished, their tracks and contracts swallowed into his network. To the public, the streetcars kept running. To Whitney, the city was his. This was no mere business venture. It was a monopoly of movement. Whitney controlled not just the routes, but the fares, the schedules, the labor, and even the narrative. Newspapers, often swayed by his influence, painted his empire as a public good, a marvel of modern efficiency. The reality was far darker. Beneath the polished surface of his streetcar kingdom lay a machine fueled by exploitation, its wheels greased by the sweat of workers who were as essential as they were invisible. Picture the life of a streetcar worker in Whitney's New York. You rise before dawn in a cramped, damp tenement, sharing a room with strangers to afford the rent. Your wage, perhaps $10 a week, equivalent to roughly $300 today, barely covers food, let alone a family's needs. You report to work at 4 a.m., climbing aboard a streetcar for a grueling 16-hour shift. There are no breaks, no respite from the bone-chilling winter or the suffocating summer heat. Your hands blister on the controls, your lungs fill with soot, and your ears ring with the shouts of impatient passengers. The city's dangers are ever present: runaway wagons, reckless pedestrians, and the constant threat of derailment. A single mistake, a moment of exhaustion, and you're out, replaced by the next desperate soul in line. There are no pensions, no health care, no safety nets. You are a cog in Whitney's machine, indispensable yet disposable. These workers, conductors, motormen, trackmen, were the backbone of New York's mobility, yet they were denied even a shred of dignity. Early attempts at unionization were met with swift retribution. Whitney's empire depended on their silence, and he ensured it through a web of control that extended beyond the workplace. His influence reached into City Hall, the press, and even the police, creating a system where dissent was not just discouraged, but erased. By the mid-1890s, however, the cracks in this system began to show. Across the nation, labor unrest was rising, and New York streetcar workers, inspired by strikes in cities like Cleveland and Chicago, started to organize. The 1895 streetcar strike was a watershed moment, a quiet rebellion that dared to demand the basics: shorter hours, a living wage, safer conditions. These were not radical calls for power, but pleas for survival. Yet to Whitney, they were a threat not just to profit, but to the carefully crafted image of his empire. The Metropolitan Street Railway Company was a darling of Wall Street, its stock a symbol of stability and monopoly power. Any hint of unrest, strikes, picket lines, or negative headlines risked shaking investor confidence. Whitney moved with ruthless efficiency to smother the rebellion. Historical records, including New York Times archives and internal memos preserved in the New York Historical Society, reveal a chilling strategy. Strikes were downplayed or outright ignored in the press, with editors guided by Whitney's allies. Worker deaths or injuries were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Armed guards rode the streetcars, and police escorted strikebreakers to break picket lines. In some cases, private security firms akin to the Pinkertons were deployed to intimidate organizers. The message was clear: resistance would be crushed. The strikes faltered, their momentum snuffed out. Workers were blacklisted, fired, or worse. The city, oblivious, kept moving. Whitney's victory was not just financial, but ideological. He had mastered the art of control, not through brute force alone, but through a sophisticated blend of suppression, propaganda, and political leverage. This was no isolated cruelty, but a playbook borrowed from the Gilded Age's darkest corners. Whitney's methods echoed those of Leland Stanford, whose Central Pacific Railroad exploited Chinese immigrants to carve tracks through the Sierra Nevadas. Like Stanford, Whitney paid his workers as little as possible, subjected them to deadly conditions, and controlled the narrative to keep the public ignorant and investors content. But Whitney's stage was not the remote mountains. It was the heart of Manhattan, where his empire operated in plain sight, hidden by its own ubiquity. The human toll was staggering, yet it unfolded in slow motion, lacking the dramatic bloodshed of the Homestead Steel Strike or the Great Southwest Strike. Whitney's workers were not gunned down in a single clash, but worn down over years of relentless toil. Each 16-hour shift, each denied sick day, each suppressed protest chipped away at their lives. This was not mismanagement, but a deliberate strategy, a financial warfare that prioritized profit over humanity. And yet, Whitney was no villain in the public eye. He was a philanthropist, a statesman, a donor to hospitals and art. He served in Cleveland's cabinet and was hailed as a progressive force. His name adorned institutions, his legacy polished by a society that saw only the surface. The workers who powered his empire, meanwhile, remain nameless, their sacrifices buried beneath the city's asphalt. This contradiction outlived Whitney himself. His descendants, Harry Payne Whitney and Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, carried the family name into the 20th century. Their wealth funding museums, films, and political campaigns. Their legacies were celebrated, but they were built on the backs of men who had nothing to leave behind. The Whitney name became synonymous with American success, while the workers' names faded into oblivion. William Whitney's empire was a masterclass in control, a reminder that power often hides in the mundane, in the routes we take, the systems we rely on, the labor we take for granted. His story is not just a footnote in the Gilded Age, but a warning. Beneath the hum of progress, the clang of injustice still rolls, its wheels as relentless as ever.